Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler, a guy trying to convey what I call a better human story. Usually, uh, feel like I can't get people to listen to something about the big picture because people just don't aren't looking for that. And I am also very happy to talk about the particulars of where we are today with the whole uh, battle between democracy and fascism in America, which is really quite a profound thing and which connects with my better human story, which um, I recently posted a video and some text in my forlorn and continuing effort to sort of break through with something I really truly believe could have a beneficial impact. And I really didn't expect that to say that it took off would probably would create an exaggerated uh, notion of virality, which I have not achieved with this thing, but it was multiples of the uh, what I was expecting, and it was it was kind of funny the downside of discovering that people were actually interested was that I started to think about, oh well, if I'd known people were going to be that interested, I would have made sure I did a better job. And there was one particular piece of it that I felt like I really hadn't made the point well enough, and the point was important enough that I wish I had taken a little more time to be compelling about the assertion is making about the implications of a creature stepping across the threshold out of the niche in which it evolved biologically and by inventing its own way of life and thus embarking in the direct onto the path of civilization, which is a way of living on the planet that has not been selected for biologically, but is the creation of the creature who's building a cultural system uh, that allows this new way of life. What's important to me is sort of the irresistibility of it. Um, and in spite of my having a lot of years of experience writing or delivering a talk to show how irresistible certain conclusions, uh, when I was doing that video, didn't want to get bogged down into something that I could, back in the 1980s, I delivered various 1 hour talks. So I kind of shied away from showing that it's inescapable that the step onto the path of civilization unleashes a selective force that drives the evolution of that creature's civilization in certain directions that are entirely predictable and are inevitable, therefore predictable, and that are not a function of the nature of the creature. It's got to do with seeing things in systematic terms. Uh, the the breakout from biologically evolved order was an unprecedented thing to happen in the history of life on Earth that had been going on for 3.5 billion years, and people have really not paid a whole lot of attention, as far as I'm concerned, to understanding what the implications of that breakout are, which are enormous, which form the essential idea that I've been building upon. That's the parable of tribes, the problem of power and social evolution. And here's my. I hope I'll do a better job showing the irresistibility of this thing. That inevitably, and this is going to be my starting point, and I'll go from here. Given that the breakthrough into civilization will create an anarchic system among civilized societies that have to interact with each other. And given that that anarchy will inevitably lead to a war of all against all, and you know, I'm just going to take those as given and then talk about the implications of that. First thing is the breakout from the biological niche really opens the gates to a whole range of cultural diversity. Not that all hunting and gathering societies are the same, but once you break out into the path of civilization, where you've got different food production, different population, different political structure, and all that stuff, all kinds of things become possible. So you got that kind of variation. Variation is sort of in a way that's analogous to Darwinian selection, but this is going to be a different kind of selection, which has got problems to it. At the same time, given that there's going to be a war of all against all, what that means is, and I think it's that only the societies that have the power necessary, of the kinds necessary to survive in a world where there's a war of all against all, will survive and spread. In other words, out of all that cultural diversity, if you do have a war of all against all, and if sometimes one society conquers another, and et cetera, that means that the ones that don't do well in the war of all against all will tend to disappear, either exterminated or transformed or just marginalized. And the ones that do have what it takes to survive in a war of all against all, their ways will survive and spread. So that in itself is a selective process. Then there are two ways of looking at this. First of all, it's not like an NCAA tournament that the winners go on to the next level and the losers go home to non-existence. It's not that systematic, but if you've got thousands of years and the chronic state of intersocietal conflict that you see in with following the rise of civilization, war becomes chronic in a way that I don't believe that it ever was in the hunting gathering stages. But you can see that over time there will be a selective process for the ways of power, where power is the whatever it takes to prevail in intersocietal conflict. That's non-random, and one can say, if you look into it, which I spent pretty much of a decade looking at all this stuff, that the power of a civilization is a function of just about every part of a culture. It's a function of economic structure and political structure, the psychological structure of its people, the technology. Even the religion can help fortify or weaken a country for the war of all against all. And so when you've got some societies surviving, or some cultural options, let's put it that way, and through societies, the societies that have those cultural options ordering them, that they get the power to prevail in the selection for whatever succeeds will be a selection that over time is sifting through different technologies, sifting through different political structures, sifting through different psychological structures. Not that the power of a society depends on one thing or another, but there are various combinations that work and don't work at different times in history. But the ones that survive to spread themselves in the world are the selective process for what prevails will mold all of those dimensions to a varying extent. So that China today and the United States today are very different in some ways, but there are major ways in which we are the same, which is what makes us, and those ways are what make us the most powerful countries in the world right now. And I go through basically all the different structural things, or not all, but a bunch of what's been selected for, including a whole chapter on the various psychological structures that have been selected for different structures, actually, at different phases of our history. Like you want one kind of structure in a world such as existed in the times of slavery and empires. But you want another one in an age where you've got, say, highly technological warfare. Okay. And you can see that in the pages of our history, you can see how, for example, the Iron Age replaced the Bronze Age, which is one way in which you can say, here's an innovation that is selected for over this older innovation, the bronze that people made. The technology gets selected for in terms of what gives you the ability to prevail. A society with an effective central control, the Roman Empire, gets to put its imprint on a big swath of the world because of the various things that made Rome so powerful. So we still use their language in a great many ways, talking about issues of power. The people who had domesticated the horse and were able to become mounted warriors had a huge advantage over people who are simply on their feet on the ground. Anyway, it goes on. You can see that in the course of history, there has been a selective process in which civilization evolved in the direction of the ways of power. And that begins at the very beginning. Yeah, one of the things which I believe you know what I'm talking about. Archaeology shows that more advanced agricultural civilizations began in Anatolia, sort of the near Middle East, the Caucasus, something there where in European civilization is starting to emerge in the form of farmers, a farmer-based economy. And meanwhile, the rest of Europe, moving up north and I guess it's west, is still hunting-gathering societies. And then there's this selective process where you can see that because of the uncontrolled nature of power in this new world, it's unregulated, the anarchy, the powerful agricultural societies, they're powerful because they can feed a lot of people, and for I don't know what their political structure was, but agriculture just simply is more powerful than hunter-gatherers. And it's not surprising that by one means and another, and I don't know how much of it was squeezing out and how much of it was extermination and how much of it was the hunter-gatherers just freely joined or whatever, but the hunter-gatherers disappear and the more powerful agricultural system is selected for. Not that any humankind ever took a vote. You know, one anthropologist has this famous line of no hunting-gathering people has ever gone to civilization as to a better good. So people haven't been choosing pretty much right along. And another place you can look in history in terms of this more powerful system is selected for because of this struggle for power that goes on in the anarchic system, is replacing and transforming these other societies, and that is the spread of industrial civilization. You know, the European powers with their industrial civilization generated a kind of power, gunboat diplomacy, that could subdue other societies and bring them into their power system. Not that the old traditional society, cultural ways were, obliterated and removed. The people in Morocco are not, Frenchmen, um, but European civilization definitely transformed the world in certain directions that had to do with the power of European civilization, economic systems and technological systems. The Japanese, when they saw what was happening in China, decided we got to become like the Europeans or they'll gobble us up. So they industrialized. They got themselves up to the point where they could defend themselves and even be aggressors in the white man's power struggle, beating the Russians in 1905, going a little too, biting off more than they could chew, and they awakened the sleeping giant by bombing Pearl Harbor in 41. But they were, even though they were still Japan and hardly to be mistaken for being an American civilization, they had transformed themselves by adopting the ways of power. This has been going on for, whatever, at least, 5,000 years. And I think you could probably see it emerging in the 5,000 years before that. The selection for the ways of power. Another way I have of illustrating that is the actual so-called parable of the tribes that came to me very early in the process after I got, basically slammed on the head with that idea in 1970. The place where there was sort of a model that came to me fairly early on that had to do with what I wrote that's in that book and various other places, the parable. And it's the thing that reviewers seem to fasten upon. And it goes like this. Imagine a group of tribes living within reach of each other. And these are all kinds of different cultural possibilities, let's just say. If all choose the way of peace, then all may live in peace. But what if all but one chooses peace? What are the options facing the other societies? What are the possible outcomes? And what I show, just to cut to the chase, I'll go back. What I show is all the options spread the ways of power. All of them. And then going back, let's say that the society that's bent upon predation and expansion invades its neighbor too because of its desire to grow in power and command more territory and all that. And it exterminates those people, which pages of history are full of versions of that, and moves their own cultural domination into the territory that they've emptied out. So the ways of power have spread by the expansion of that empire. And then how about the next one? Because if it's bent upon predation and expansion, and by the way, I use this as a model to show just how much of a contaminant power is in an anarchic system where there's war of all against all, where there's no regulation of the interactions. The second people are also conquered, but instead of exterminating them, they colonize the conquered society. They absorb that piece of humanity into their power system as slaves or whatever form it might take. And they leave their culture alone when it doesn't matter to them, but they also transform their culture in whatever ways they're able to that enhances the conqueror's interest, more wealth, more power, whatever it is. Once again, the ways of power have spread Two different options, but in that respect, same outcome. Third possibility, a society of a peaceful nature sees what's happening to its neighbors and says, I'm not going to sit around waiting for that. We're not strong enough or whatever. I don't want to fight them. And they leave. They go, they retreat to some place in the world where they're out of reach. And into modern times, there were such places that were out of reach of the world's power systems. But essentially, that's not true anymore. I think we've witnessed pretty much the end of that. Anyway, people go to the Arctic or they go to the jungles or they just happen to be there in the first place. But if they leave a vacancy in this original system that we had of, imagine a group of tribes, let's say 20 of them, all but one of them choosing peace, and that one of them is essentially continuing to want to extend its power. It's not random what kind of a society it'll be. I bring up things like the spirit of the gangster. That's what's going to be selected for, is, what the gangster creates because it's seeking power. Gets a disproportionate say, and here we're seeing why. If they vacated a piece of land, that the conqueror goes in, and once again, the empire, the ways of power have spread. And then there's the fourth option that societies take to defend themselves. We're going to keep that guy at bay because we're powerful enough to repel him. And that is an escape hatch, but only to a limited degree. I mean, if you're a hunter-gatherer society, you just don't have the means as such to resist an incoming agricultural empire power. If you're an archaic agricultural society, with Harrison Ford with the gun confronting the guy with the sword in that comic showdown scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, if you are the China of the early 19th century, you're not necessarily equipped to deal with an industrial capitalist power that's got gunboats at your doorstep. In order to resist having the imperialist power spread his ways to you, you got to match his power, which means you've got to voluntarily spread some of his ways to you. If he's industrialized, you got to be industrialized, as the Japanese realized when confronted with European imperialism. So that's a way of protecting the independence of a society rather than having it be conquered or having it escape to some remote place. But it wasn't the freedom to continue necessarily as they wished. Again, they are compelled, as humankind in general has been since the beginnings of civilization, compelled to live in civilizations that are shaped unduly by the selective process that chooses what confers power in an anarchic system where there's a war of all against all. The ways of power, once introduced, will tend to spread inexorably until it pervades the whole. There's a selection process going on here. It's analogous to the Darwinian one, but the fact that it's superimposed on the one that was evolved for the selection for life and not for power, it's problematic. There's variation, different kinds of culture, different ways of conceiving what a human society might be like. And then not all of them survive into the future. Over the course of thousands of years, the number of different human cultures in the world have gone down way, way much, just a fraction. And it's not random. And this is like Darwin. All these things are like Darwin. It's not random which ones survive and which do not. But whereas the biological evolutionary process creates certain kinds of whole that are, they got their problems inside them, but around them, it's a protective order that means that, hey, this is going to go on. You know, everything's going to be okay in terms of the life per se thriving. But you get outside of that system in civilization, and you've got this superimposed on the life that's been selected for and the living processes that order the whole thing is this now the selection for the ways of power and the growth of a thing which is increasingly powerful and not reliably governed by any force that serves life. The superimposition on top of the one that was life of the one that's power means that we got a problem. And the problem is you got to find a way of creating the order you need in a form that is embedded in the civilization to perform all the necessary harmonizing functions that kept life alive for 3.5 billion years when there was only one evolutionary process that was based on a great many and only some surviving and a selection that was non-random for which ones get to be part of the future, which created great wholeness. And civilization introduces a new kind of brokenness. And that's what the parable of the tribes is about. And I also maintain that perspective helps us understand better the nature of the battle in America that's been going on for a generation, but has particularly come to a disastrous showdown in the election of 2024. There are connections that could be made to say that what we are trying to do by preserving a constitutional order in this country against the force of fascism is part of the longer picture of how we as a species have been trying to deal with the problem of power and social evolution. Imagine a group of tribes. They found that there was a problem of power. We in America right now have a particular historical version of the problem of power. And it's not at the moment clear to me that we're going to solve our problem acceptably anytime soon, but I sure as hell hope so. I don't want to die seeing this country in this condition. Thanks. If you're interested in seeing these big pictures laid out, this was the piece I didn't think I developed well enough, which is it's inevitable. The thing that the systemic nature of what civilization plunges into generates a force that selects among the cultural options and mandates that civilization will evolve in certain directions, inevitably. And you can see it in the very analogous ways in which the 6 places where civilization first emerged on its own, the great parallelisms that they don't show human nature. They basically show what happens when there's a selective process for those human cultural creations and people who prevail in a war of all against all. It's inevitable. Any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos that steps across onto the path of civilization will get into the same selective process and will have that some way of the spirit of the gangster have a disproportionate say in how its civilization develops, up until such time as that creature is able to impose the kind of order you need to control that destructive force. I say it's a toss-up whether we're going to be able to do that in the next several generations, next 2 centuries, I don't know. A toss-up. But these developments of what's happened to American politics have not increased my optimism about the possibility of humankind undertaking the huge and hugely consequential task of ordering its civilization well enough and soon enough to avoid destroying itself. We haven't been moving forward lately, and we need to make a lot of progress. So it's a heavy time to be alive. It is a weight on my heart that this is what the American electorate chose, and this is what we're going to have to deal with into the future, with some very ugly possibilities looking all too plausible. The ways of power, the problem of power, the destructive force that emerges with civilization. Thank you. A betterhumanstory.org.